Thank you for having me here today, and I'll start by telling you a little bit about the Trust. So the Bumblebee Conservation Trust was established in 2006 by Professor Dave Goulson. He wanted to address some serious concerns he and fellow scientists had about the plight of the bumblebee. They recognised that something had to be done if we were going to stop and reverse the decline in our bumblebees across the UK. So the Trust is essentially a science-based and evidence-led charity, which has been key to a lot of our successes over the last 17 years. We act and get results from research, and we take a balanced and evidence-supported approach to our actions to help bumblebees. I've been with the Trust for just over a year, and in that time I think we've averaged about one new staff member a month, so we're growing really rapidly at the moment. We have over 60 staff members, we have hundreds of volunteers on the books, and we have thousands of members. So bumblebees are both a flagship and a keystone species. As our most charismatic and easily recognised pollinators in the UK, bumblebees make a really good flagship species. The actions that we take to support bumblebees to flourish in our landscapes will inevitably have many benefits far and wide for other wildlife, which is the role of a flagship species in conservation. As a keystone species, bumblebees most certainly fulfil this role too. They underpin ecosystem function. So in terms of bumblebees as a keystone species, their disappearance from our ecosystems would impact our food production quite badly. Wildflowers would dwindle, habitats would suffer, birds and other seed and fruit eating species would start to find that food had become quite scarce. And all in all, bumblebees disappearing from our landscape would be pretty bad news. So a couple of bumblebee facts for you. Over the last 80 years, we've seen two of our bumblebees become nationally extinct. These are the Cullum's bumblebee, Bombus cullumunus, last recorded in 1941, and the short-haired bumblebee, Bombus subterraneus, last recorded in Dungeness in 1988. Several of our other species that were once common and quite widespread now exist in small and fairly isolated populations. We do a lot of work with the more rare and scarce species to try and expand their ranges and make sure that they still have a viable population in the UK. Bumblebees are a cold adapted species. We believe they evolved in the Himalayas quite a long time ago. They wear a big fur jacket, and they generate a lot of body heat through using their wings. So they can fly when most other insects find it too cold. We tend to say temperatures as low as 10 degrees, but I've seen them flying in around 8 and 9 degrees as well. On a full honey stomach, they can only fly for about 40 minutes. So a full honey stomach, that's all the energy it gives them. After that, they're in trouble and they need to find resources fast. If you find a drowsy bumblebee, the best thing to do is pop them on a flower nearby so that they can feed. Please don't take them into your homes because they can't survive indoors. They won't find the resources they need there. If there aren't any flowers nearby, sugar or honey dissolved in water is okay as a last resort. This is a fact that I think is really cool. Bumblebees and other bees in general know when a flower won't have any resources available for them because another bee has visited the flower and fed on it recently. This is to do with the transfer of positive ions, which the bee picks up when they're flying, transferring onto the flower, which usually has a slightly negative charge. After the bee visits, the charge of the flower is neutral for a little while, and it leaves them an electrical hint for the next bee that that flower won't have any resources available for a little while because it takes the flower a while to replenish the nectar cup. So looking at bees in the UK, a lot of people are surprised to find that we have around about 270 species of bee. It's really hard to arrive at an exact number because taxonomists will separate out what we thought was one species into two or more, and new solitary bee species are arriving all the time from Europe. 24 of these species are bumblebees, one's the honeybee, and the rest are, as I've mentioned, solitary bees. So solitary bees differ from honeybees and bumblebees in that they don't have a social life sort of nest structure. The adults will mate. The female will make a nest where she'll lay the eggs. She'll provision the nest chambers with a little bit of food for the developing offspring. She'll seal it up and she'll fly away. The young will develop inside the nest and they emerge the following year as adult bees. In contrast, bumblebees and honeybees, their nest structure is to have a queen, and the queen will produce lots of workers that will help her raise more offspring over the year. So I like to look at the difference between bumblebees and honeybees because when the media speak about the bee, they're often using pictures of honeybees and they're often talking about honeybees, which has led to things being quite confused. So some of the main differences between honeybees and bumblebees. Bumblebees are our native wild pollinators, as are solitary bees, and they don't depend on human beings for much of their care. They'll feed from the flowers in our gardens, they'll feed on our crops, but they could live here quite happily without us. Honeybees, on the other hand, are mostly dependent on the efforts of the beekeepers to keep them alive, and they're not technically native wild fauna. The beekeepers will keep them in hives and they'll treat them with medicines and they'll keep the hive clean for them. Honeybees in the UK are mostly domesticated, so I think of them as being a bit like livestock. They're a species that we farm for honey. They're not endangered and they're not suffering the same declines as our bumblebees. You will find the odd feral colony in the UK, especially in the south, but they are really a Mediterranean species. There's just the one species of honeybee in the UK, whereas we've got 24 bumblebees. And so what you do find and what gets confused with honeybees quite often is that there are different ecotypes of honeybees, and they're prevalent across different parts of Europe and different parts of the UK as well. It's a bit like different varieties of plants. So you've got, hundreds of varieties of dahlia. They all look a little bit different, but when it comes down to the genetics of it, they are all just one species. There is a huge difference in the colony size between bumblebees and honeybees. So depending on the species, you might find 50 to 400 workers in a bumblebee colony, and their nest is about the size of a football. The honeybee nest can be an awful lot bigger, and they can have up to 50,000 workers in a colony. They can easily outcompete our native bumblebees for resources where they're a bit thin on the ground, and they don't get any help from human carers when times are tough. Beekeepers sometimes move the hives when one area becomes depleted in resources, but bumblebees can't move their nests. So this practice can be a little bit tricky for bumblebees if the resources in one area just aren't plentiful enough to support all of the bees that are now foraging there. Unfortunately, a lot like myself, bumblebees haven't learned to dance yet. Honeybees have this great intricate little dance they do and that's how they tell each other where to find food outside of the hive. Bumblebees don't do that, but we do think they pass information to their nestmates about which flowers are in season by sharing pollen grains or the scents from the flowers with each other. So in bumblebees, it will only be the queen that survives the winter. The rest of the nest will die off in the autumn. The queen will feed up and she'll hibernate over winter. The honeybee colony will survive over winter. The queen will survive and quite a lot of the workers will stay with her. And that's why they make honey, to feed the workers and the queen through the winter when there aren't any flowers available. So the last point is that bumblebees are struggling because of flower shortages, which has mostly been caused by habitat change. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. Honeybees are struggling a lot due to diseases such as the varroa and different viral infections. These can be treated by honeybee keepers and kept at bay with good husbandry. Sadly, there is a mounting base of evidence that suggests that some diseases common in honeybees can actually spread to our native wild pollinators. So that is basically a summing up of the difference between the two. So we'll have a quick look at the life cycle of a bumblebee. If we start our quick dash through the cycle in the spring, the queens will be emerging from hibernation. They will be carrying already fertilized eggs, and after a long winter sleep, they will have used up most of their energy reserves and they'll be pretty hungry. They will need to feed and they need to find a suitable place to nest. Where that would be would vary from species to species, but the majority of our bumblebees nest in or on the ground. So over the spring, you might see a bumblebee searching for a nest, a queen bee. She'll be flying quite low to the ground and she'll be looking for any potential holes to investigate as a good nest space. Early nest establishment is a really vulnerable time for bumblebees. At this point, the freshly laid brood of workers are entirely dependent on the queen to do all of the foraging for them and feed them to maturity. Once the first batch of workers reaches maturity, the queen will then stay in the nest for the rest of the life cycle. The workers will gather food for her and the subsequent broods of workers and males and the new queens. The workers are busy little bees and they don't stay still for very long. Towards the end of the nest cycle, the nest will start to produce new queens and males. The males are actually unfertilized eggs, and these are the new reproductives that will mate and continue the cycle for next year. Now, in my next life, I would like to be a male bumblebee because it's a pretty good life. They don't forage for the nest. They only feed themselves. They have a much more laid back approach to things than the busy little workers. And you'll often find them taking it easy, relaxing on a flower. Once the males have left the nest, they don't return. They'll sleep outside and they'll shelter in vegetation or little crevices that they find in places. At the end of the nest cycle, the workers, the males, and the old queen will all die off, and the new queens will need to find a place to hibernate. They will usually choose a north-facing site so they can avoid being woken up on that one nice day we have in February, only to find there's no food and it's cold the next day. And it will generally have a loose substrate that they can bury themselves in, or a hole at the base of a tree, or a similar situation. Although I have seen a picture of a queen hibernating in somebody's plant pot, so sometimes they crop up in unusual places. So these are what I call the big six. These are the most common bumblebees that you will find in gardens. This is an illustration of the queens. The workers tend to be almost a carbon copy, but smaller, of the queen. Males might look quite different. They're often a lot more yellow than the queens. You might find something that isn't listed here on the big six in your garden, and I would be really very jealous. We're always happy to help you with identifying a bumblebee at the Trust if you need that. If you can get a couple of good photographs, please do feel free to email them over to inquiries, and I'll pop the email address in the chat at the end of the session, and we'll get back to you with an ID or to let you know why we can't work out which bumblebee it is. So another fun fact for you. It's only the hair on the bumblebees which has any colour. If you pulled out all of the hair from a bumblebee, which I neither encourage nor condone, the bumblebee would be entirely black and shiny and look a bit like one of the big black beetles that we have in the UK. So in 2001, the big six became the big seven. The tree bumblebee came over from France in 2001, we think entirely naturally, and it's made really rapid progress through the country, as you can see on the map here. I've actually found them as far up as Montrose in Scotland, and our team up in the Highlands have started to record them now too. They're largely an urban bee, so you tend to find them more in cities and towns than you do in the wider countryside. And as the name suggests, they tend to like to nest in crevices in trees. So unlike the rest of our native bumblebees that prefer to nest in or on the ground, these guys like to go up high. They will also use bird boxes. Sometimes you'll find them trying to nest in the eaves of your house. If you see a bumblebee that isn't nesting in or on the ground, it's going to be one of these guys. Our science manager describes these as Neapolitan ice cream with those three really distinct stripes. So you've got your ginger stripe, the black stripe, and the white stripe. The queens, males, and workers all look the same. They're just different sizes. So this is a really nice, easy one to try and identify. In the summer, the males might accumulate at the entrance to a nest and look a bit like a swarm. Bumblebees don't swarm like honeybees do. This is entirely natural behaviour, and they're actually just waiting for the new queens to come out of the nest to mate with. Bumblebees are not by nature aggressive. I think of them as being tiny flying pandas. They will only sting if they feel really threatened, and male bumblebees actually can't sting you at all. They don't have a stinger. So it's really nothing to worry about. Once the new queens emerge, the males will disperse, and it's actually really quite fascinating to watch. So bumblebees have some really convincing mimics. A lot of our flies look a lot like bumblebees or wasps, and that gives them a little bit of extra protection. The birds don't tend to go for them too much because they think they may get stung. So flies belong in the order Diptera, which means two wings. Bees, regardless of whether they're solitary, honey or bumble, they have four wings, which when they're flying around can be pretty hard to spot. Flies have massive eyes. They take up about 90% of the head. While bumblebees do have quite big eyes, they're not nearly as big as a fly's eyes. The other difference is the length of the antenna. Bumblebees have these lovely long antennae, and it's usually elbowed at where it meets the last section. Flies have quite short stubby antennae, and they often have a hair on the end of each one. So we've got to about halfway through the presentation, and I think it's time for a bit of audience participation. I'll give you 30 seconds or so to have a look at the pictures and see if you can work out which one of these from the lineup is the only bumblebee in the collection. So 7 of these are actually flies that are just doing a very convincing job of being a bumblebee, and 1 of them is actually a bumblebee. You can write your answer down. If you're really brave, you can pop it in the chat, or you can just remember which one you thought it was. And I will give you the answer at the end of the presentation. So what we're looking for is longer antennae, smaller eyes. There are a few other features, but they're not going to be terribly apparent in this picture. Okay, so let's move on. Bumblebees are one of the biggest pollinators of our crops. They're really efficient pollinators. So this includes a lot of our soft fruits, top fruits, vegetables, more or less anything that you would grow as a home grower in your garden. You have things like wheat and corn, which are wind pollinated, but they're not often things that I would expect home growers to grow in limited space. Anecdotally, I often hear 1 in every 3 mouthfuls of food you eat are down to bumblebees. I'd venture it might be a bit higher if you live in my house, because we're all vegetarian, and if you come to eat at my house, you'll get 12 of your 5 a day. So I probably should be very grateful to bumblebees. So again, looking at the difference between bumblebees and honeybees, tongue length. It becomes very important in crop pollination. So a honeybee worker, they're all the same size, with the same length of tongue, which is somewhere between 5.5 and 6.5 millimeters, which means that the range of crops that they're going to visit can be quite limited. Bumblebees, on the other hand, come in a range of shapes and sizes. So the difference in tongue length between workers and queens can be anywhere from about 5.5 millimeters up to 19.5 millimeters. So just to put that into context, while honeybees are important pollinators of crops, bumblebees are pollinating a much bigger range of crops and wildflowers. I'm going to talk to you about buzz pollination, which is very relevant if you like a tomato. It's a bumblebee's best kept secret, really. This is required by most, if not all, of the solanums. So that's your tomatoes, aubergines, chilies, peppers. Bumblebees are the only insect that pollinate tomatoes, and a few of the other home growers' favourites like blueberries, kiwis, and cranberries. The pollen in these species is held onto by the plant quite tightly in the anthers, and it's not an open all-you-can-eat buffet, as is the case with most flowers. Bumblebees know exactly how to get the pollen out of this species, though. So they fly into the flower, they hold on tight, and they use their thoracic muscles to create high-frequency vibrations, which cause the pollen to be released in a bit of a shower. It lands all over the bee. Bumblebees will groom the pollen down into sticky balls, which you can see here. It's called a pollen sac, and I always think they look a bit like the saddlebags you'd get on a bike. They will inevitably miss some of the pollen grains that get stuck to them, and these will be transported to the next flower they visit, and that will pollinate the flower. Our tomato industry now actually relies on commercial bumblebee nests, and supplying these commercial bumblebee nests is a multi-million-pound industry. Humans can achieve something similar to buzz pollination with a toothbrush or a paintbrush. And at this point, I always think it might be worth taking a moment to consider the impact that would have on the cost of these foods. If producers had to pay people by the hour to go and hand pollinate all the tomatoes, the price would go through the roof. Anything that requires buzz pollination would become a treat for the incredibly wealthy and well beyond the reach of the average mortal. So here's a picture of these bumblebee nests in the commercial tomato growers. Purely and simply, we rely on these now being imported mostly from Europe because we just don't have enough wild pollinators left to do the job for us. There's always a danger of introducing a novel pathogen or pest with them. However much screening they go through, things can get missed. That could have quite a devastating impact on our native wild bees. The imported bumblebees are a subspecies that don't occur naturally in the UK, so they're not permitted to be released into the wild. Escapes do happen, I'm sure, but essentially at the end of the growing season, all of these bumblebee nests will have to be destroyed. So we'll have a look at why bumblebees are declining, the main reasons for that. So we've established that they're really important. So them declining is obviously an issue. Well, bumblebees are declining mostly because of changes to their habitat. Since the 1940s, we've lost around 97% of our flower-rich grasslands. Scenes like the one here have given way to scenes like the one next to it. We have a lot less diverse grasslands. We don't tend to have meadows anymore. We grow silage crop, which they don't flower. The silage crops don't tend to flower. They're not much good for bumblebees. So we've changed. Our dependence on chemical pesticides has become far bigger than it ever was. And a lot of these chemicals that are used on flowering plants can persist in the tissues for many months afterwards in some cases, and they'll be expressed in the nectar of that plant, which has an impact on the animals that would feed there. So looking back at the last slide, we're also aware that there is always the danger of introducing a novel pathogen or pest accidentally, and some diseases can spread from honeybees to bumblebees. Climate change, last but not least, also has its impact. Climate change is impacting the weather and the patterns of the weather, which has a knock-on impact on the plants that bumblebees rely on to thrive. The climate is changing faster than most species, including bumblebees, can naturally respond to. So the increased unpredictability of weather and climate isn't really very good news for anyone. But we never like to finish up on doom and gloom. So we're going to take a look at some simple and achievable actions we can take to support bumblebees. And that will finish off the rest of the presentation. So we have a Be the Change campaign. Our Be the Change campaign details lots of actions that are really simple to take, but have a big impact for bumblebees. I think a lot of the time, making a difference isn't about making a huge lifestyle change. It's about taking small, sustained actions one at a time. My top 5 actions that anyone can take for bumblebees, whether you have a garden or not. You can grow a bumblebee-friendly plant. If you don't have a garden, a tub by your front door or a window box is just as good. Species like chives, oregano, strawberries will all grow happily in a window box, and you get a little bit of benefit from that too. Our social media channels, if you use social media, do please follow our social media channels and share our posts. The wider the message is shared, the bigger the impact we can have. So we can help form the bigger picture by doing some survey work. Survey informs our conservation efforts, and without the data, we can't focus on where the efforts are needed the most. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few slides' time. Start a conversation with somebody about bumblebees. Spreading the word is a really important thing to do. The more people that know bumblebees need help, the more help they'll get. I'm not here to sell you memberships, but memberships with the Trust aren't terribly expensive. So if you can support our charity, that would be fab. You get quite a lot for your money, including more bumblebees up and down the country. Hopefully the sound is going to work on this, but please somebody shout if it doesn't. This is a great little animation that was, again, biased, but it was produced by the Trust recently, and it specifically looks at how you can make room for a bumblebee nest in your garden, your allotment, or a community space, or if you ground control, how you can encourage your customers to do this too. So as I say, slightly biased. Oh, there we are. But I think that's a lovely animation. So another thing that we can all do to help bumblebees, I see more and more areas like this across the country in our open parks and our open public spaces. Use your pester power. Talk to your local authority. Talk to your clients. Talk to the people that manage your outdoor spaces and tell them that you want them to do something for pollinators. It doesn't have to be the middle of the football pitch. It doesn't have to be the part of the park that people like to sit in and eat their picnic the most. There are lots of parts of the park that are a bit underused, the difficult corners where, you know, nobody's going to go and sit in the corner to eat their sandwiches. The more requests your local authorities get to do something like that, the more they're likely to implement something. If your local authority already do this, give them some feedback and tell them that you think it's great. Ask them to relax the mowing in some areas. You don't have to let a patch grow completely wild. By just changing the mowing from being every week or every 2 weeks to every 4 to 8 weeks, you'll allow a lot of what we would generally deem the weed species, which I prefer to call beautiful native wildflowers, that are tolerant of being mown. They'll get an opportunity to flower, and they'll, you know, by doing that, they provide an extra resource that wasn't there before because they were being cut every 2 weeks. Ask your local authorities or your clients or the people that look after your green spaces to reconsider their hedge management. It's much more beneficial to manage a hedge on a 2 to 3 year cycle than an annual cutting cycle. Many of the species in a hedge, especially the native hedges, will flower on second year wood. So by cutting them every year, basically what we do is cut off the majority of the flowering stems. When the development's going in, or if you're part of the team looking at a development or planting the development, try and make the plan as pollinator positive as possible. You know, swapping out some plants for others doesn't have to be a big deal. It doesn't have to represent a huge expense. And if you need any help with doing things like that, please just ask us. That's what we're here for. So if you do have a garden, you can address the hungry gaps. So we need those early resources to support the queens to build their nests. We need a complete blossom sequence from around about the end of February, March time through to October. If we can try and have at least something in flower, there's plenty of resources there for the bumblebees. I'll talk to you a little bit more about blossom sequences in the next slide. And those essential late resources, they'll support the queens that need to feed up and hibernate. But many of our rarer species have life cycles which start a little bit later in the year, so they finish a little bit later in the year. So a lot of what we see in the countryside is, you know, people try not to cut hay until July, but there are some species that need to keep feeding and they've got workers right up until October. So by removing the resources too early, we're not really helping out the rare and scarce species. And as the video that we watched said, you know, if you have a bumblebee nest or hibernation sites in areas that you're working, just be mindful, be a little bit careful. If you disturb a hibernating bumblebee, put them back where you found them, cover them with a little bit of the substrate they were in, and they should be fine. So a blossom sequence can be quite a simple thing. This is part of a much larger blossom sequence I put together for somebody. All I do is list the species down one side, months of the year across the top, and I colour in the squares when I would expect these species to flower. When I get to the end of the sequence, I add up how many squares are in each column, and I work out if there are any gaps. Once I've worked out where the gaps are, I can work out what I need to fill them up with. However, if you don't fancy that, we've done all the hard work for you. If you'd like more information on plants that are good for bumblebees, this is the part of the website for you, the Be Kind area. So you can use this tool in a number of ways. You can tell the tool what size area that you're working in or that is your garden. You can add all the species from the list that you have, and it will give you a score for how good your garden is, and it will give you some more suggestions. Or you can use the flower finder. So what you can't see is the whole thing in the screenshot, but you can either look up a certain plant. If you have a colour scheme, you can look up a certain colour of flower. You can look up number of petals. You can look up, you can tell it if you want a tree, a shrub, a herbaceous plant, or an annual. Or you can just use it as a reference for bumblebee friendly plants. There are about 700 plants in the list. There should be something to suit just about everybody. And as promised, a bit more about becoming a citizen science. So BWalk is our own scheme. It's a national citizen science scheme, and there are lots of resources to support you to get started with this. If it's something you'd like to get involved with, I will pop the link to the YouTube channel in the chat. And it helps us form the picture that we need of how the bumblebees are doing, and it contributes to the bigger picture of what we need to do to support bumblebees to flourish. If that sounds a bit daunting, complicated, there's the POMS Fit Count, which stands for Pollinator Monitoring Schemes Flower Insect Timed Counts. These are perfect if you're a bit pushed for time, because they're only a 10-minute time commitment. You can do them as often as you like, and you don't require very much specialised species knowledge. So as long as you know what flowers you're looking at, and you can tell a butterfly from a beetle or a bee from one of the clever mimics, you can download the app to your phone. It does most of the work for you. If you've got your location settings on, it will load up where you are, and all you do is tap which group of species you're looking at. You don't need to be able to identify them to species level, it's family level. If you don't fancy either of those, but you'd still like to record wildlife, and this works for any and all species you might want to record, there's iRecord. This can be done on your computer. It can also be done on an app via your smartphone, and it's nice and simple. So if you've got a particular wildlife interest or a very general interest, that might be the one for you. So as promised, we've got to the end of the presentation, and I will reveal the answer to my wonderful quiz. Which one of these guys was the bumblebee? It's E. So we've got the longer antennae there and the smaller eyes, whereas these guys have all got huge eyes and short antennae. And that's it for me. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I'll stop the screen sharing so I can pop the bits and bobs in the chat.
Tracy, we have one question, Claire, from Tracy May, which is, can you tell her about the mason bee? She thinks she may have some in her garage windowsill.
Okay, yep, there are a few species of mason bee, and I must say I think you're really lucky to have them. Essentially, the biggest take-home message is they won't do any damage to the structure of your property. So they've been coexisting with us for a really long time. They do aggregate their nests, so or some of the species will aggregate nests. So what might look like a massive nest of a social species is actually many, many nests of solitary bees, and they'll be there helping you pollinate your plants and doing great things for you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Does anyone else have any questions for Claire? I know we've run over very slightly. Did anyone have anything they wanted to pop in the chat, or pop your hand up, or just shout out? I think you've answered everybody's questions already, Claire, by the looks of things.
Oh, Hayley, did you have a question?
Yeah, sorry, I've got a quick question. I'm a bit bee mad because I'm one of the ecologists in ground control. So thanks for that presentation. We really enjoyed it. I've got an old bird box that I filled full of moss and old nesting material to put up for the purpose of bumblebee nests. Which way should I face the box?
Well, bumblebees, unlike so solitary bees, if you're siting a solitary bee house, you'd go for somewhere that's south facing and in the sunshine. So tree bumblebees will be a bit less fussy, but I would probably angle it maybe towards the west, so that it doesn't get the sunshine all day.
Yeah.
Because when we have a year like we had last year, it got so hot. I was trying to do surveys over. Excuse me, I'm just getting over a nasty cold actually. So I was trying to do surveys in that really hot period, and what we find is that the bumblebees just all disappear. It's too hot for them to fly, and they put an awful lot of their energy into venting the nest and trying to keep it cool enough.
Brilliant, thank you.
No problem.
Any other questions from anybody? Right, fab. Well, thanks ever so much, Claire. That's fantastic. Thank you for popping everything as well into the chat, and I'm sure we'll share the love of that later on and share that around. Thank you so much for your time today. That was a brilliant presentation, really interesting. I know I've learned loads today, and I hope everybody else has too. And we wanted to just say a big thank you from Ground Control.
Oh, you're very welcome, and please do feel free to get in touch with the Trust if there's anything we can help you with, or if you have any questions that pop up as you go through your day like you do in the queue in Tesco's, and it suddenly occurs to you really want to know something.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. Thanks everybody, and we'll see you all again hopefully next week.